Termo to Madeline, audio edition. Page 358, chapter titled, Lac Salt versus Smoke Creek. The Little Man Wins. Now, there were extensive changes in the ownership of lands shortly after the war. One of the big changes came on August 20th, 1919, when Elmer Van Loan sold the Van Loan Ranch to Peter Lac Salt. Pete got 3,500 acres for $10,000. The Mowers, of course, had to move out. Ross came back a few years in the 20s, but did not stay long. Things were different now and then, now that the sheep man was in ownership of the property. It brought on a change for Brockmans also. At one time, they and Van Loans ran large numbers of horses and cattle together. The range was all open, and the two parties each ran on others' land as well as their own. It was a different situation, however, when Pete Lac Salt moved in. Maybe sheep and cattle did not get along, but more often sheepmen and cattlemen did not get along. Pete and Lac Salt and William Brockman were always at loggerheads with each other and eventually had to fence between the two properties. This required some trading in order to put all the Lac Salt land on one side of the fence and all the Brockman on the others. Willis traded McDonald Flat and the old Mower timber culture to Lac Salt, and he, in turn, got Skeleton Flat and Pete's property around Lanning Spring. The most extensive party changes took place, however, with the arrival of Smoke Creek outfit at Madeline. They bought up land by the thousands of acres. Herb Humphrey and Bill Moffett were the major owners of the outfit at the time. They owned vast acreages of land and thousands of sheep and cattle all over Nevada and the West. When they went broke trying to corner the wool market in 1923, a receiver took over and the new corporation was formed. The organization continued to change rapidly over the next few years, but each successive board of directors had bigger ideas, bought more land, leaned more heavily on their little neighbors, and generally made a bigger mess of the corporation for whoever took over when they went broke. There was nothing the little operation could do to protest when the enormous operation ran over them. How could anyone stand up against such a massive outfit? Most like John Williams just bided their time, knowing from past experience that such a scattered and bloated setup was destined to failure. They generally held the attitude that we suffered through the last uncooperative grass-stilling outfit until they were folded and gone. And we'll do the same here with you. Now, it was not of the nature of Pete Lac Salt to be walked on. In fact, there were those who accused him of walking on everybody else. In actuality, he was no small-time operator himself, running as many as 10,000 sheep in the early 20s. He was one of the largest livestock men on the Madeline Plains, but alongside the Smoke Creek outfit, he was minuscule. Minuscule or not, Smoke Creek was not going to push Pete Lac Salt around. Once again, the local rancher had the advantage of living on the land, and Lac Salt used the advantage to his fullest. Pete had a homestead and other lands that he bought on the east side of McDonald Peak. Like the Smoke Creek outfit, he owned a long string of 40s running off into Nevada, where he watered his sheep. The Smoke Creek outfit owned Tule Lake, and he bought up all the land along Cedar Creek. Water was the main problem in the 20s and 30s. A long drought was strangling the livestock operators on the plains due to the dryness. Feed was critically in short supply, but without water, animals could not even get what little there was. So water is what started the fight. If Smoke Creek sheep could drink up all Lac Salt's water, a relatively easy task with their thousands of sheep, he would have to go elsewhere, leaving the feed for them. In June of 1924, they made their first move. One of their headers moved in with close to 2,000 sheep and drank up all the water in Box Spring. When Pete Lac Salt called him down on it, he gave the old answer of not knowing where he was and had assumed he was in Smoke Creek land. So he and the other Smoke Creek herders told Pete to water his sheep at Cedar Creek. The Smoke Creek outfit finished all their employees with trespass reports, which they were required to fill out whenever there was a trespass on the Smoke Creek properties. Thus, every time they watered their sheep at one of Pete's water holes, forcing him to take his sheep to Cedar Creek or Tule Lake, a trespass report was filed out on him. And in 1923, there were 18 of these reports issued to Pete Laxalt that stacked up in the Smoke Creek Outfit's files in the Reno. The two parties held a conference in Reno in 1923 to resolve their differences. There, all the trespass complaints on both sides were liquidated. The Smoke Creek Outfit had unfenced land everywhere. Laxalt had unfenced land scattered over 24 townships, 36 by 24 miles in area. Therefore, a certain amount of minor trespassing could not be avoided. Thus, after the conference, the quarrel was settled for 1 year. The year 1924, however, saw the old game of intimidation started up once again. Trespass reports were filed out, private waters were stolen, Smoke Creek dries were purposely mixed with Laxalt ewes and lambs, feed was trampled and stolen. But much to the huge corporation's amazement, Pete Laxalt held his own. Every time they trod on him, he trod back twice as hard. Stated simply, he just would not go away. Finally, in the summer of 1924, the Smoke Creek Outfit filed suit against Pete Laxalt. At this point, most of the Smoke Creek's little neighbors would have sued for peace, but not being able to afford the attorneys and court expenses, and not so with Pete Laxalt. He stood up and fought, turning right around and filing a countersuit. In the end, he beat the pants off them, too. Being as big as they were, the Smoke Creek Outfit had enough borrowed money to burn. They appealed the case to a state appellate court. Laxalt still did not back down. He fought that one and the finish, and he won that one, too. Smoke Creek made one last effort to squash the troublesome nobody. However, by making a final appeal to the California State Supreme Court. By the time Pete Laxalt won that case, the Smoke Creek Outfit was on its last legs. Soon after, it made a final plunge and collapsed out of existence forever. Pete used to tell people he had broke the imposing Smoke Creek Outfit. Although he may not have been totally responsible, he had definitely had a hand in its folding. The livestock operators on the Madeline Plains were not unhappy to see it happen either. Although the litigation had not helped Pete's pocketbook, he had also not backed down from a bullying outsider, a principle that he was probably more concerned about than the money anyway. Next chapter, titled 5th District Supervisors. Now, in order to give the people of the Madeline Plains representation at the county seat in Susanville, the area was partitioned off and named the 5th Supervisorial District, the last to be organized in Lassen County. The 5th supervisor elected to represent the new district was Webb Spaulding of Red Rock. Over the next few years, the job was traded back and forth between east side and west side of the plains almost equally. After Mr. Spaulding came John Williams. He only held the position for one term, deciding his position as road overseer along with the job of justice of the peace was better suited to him. After John Williams, Willis Brockman held the position for several terms. One of the major jobs of the supervisor was to develop and maintenance of the roads in the district. He had to procure the funds at the county level to pay for labor, materials, and equipment. Things were vastly different than now. These were the days of mud and dust, pick and shovel, and horsepower and manpower working side by side. During the time that Willis Brockman's supervisor, the 5th District obtained an enormous excavator that required a 16 or 18 horse jerkline team to drag. Compared to the old method of Fresno scrapers and number 2 shovels, the excavator was a great improvement. With it, a levee could be quickly built up with a ditch on each side to carry the water. It still took a lot of men and horses to cut through the new road for the placement of the culverts, bridges, and so on. During those years that Willis Brockman was at the helm, improved roads were built all over the Madeline Plains. These were roads built above the normal water line. Oh, they got muddy all right, real muddy, considering they still did not have gravel. But a Model T Ford or horse and buggy could travel down them. providing they did not slide off into the ditch, without sloshing along through standing water, of course. During the summers, there was no more or no less dusty than the trails of the past. Just after the turn of the century, Willis had hired a tunnel dug in the side of the mountain just in the back of the Brockman house. They had been trying to hit water, but had basically failed, although they did hit a little seepage. Now, during this time as supervisor, the tunnel was put to good use. The county road workers were always having to blast through solid rock somewhere as they built roads over some of the hills on the plains. So the tunnel was converted into a powder magazine to store their dynamite. Jim Godman of Ravendale held the supervisor position for 10 years following World War I. By this time, the county road department was becoming mechanized. Soon, dump trucks were part of the road equipment, and eventually a motorized grader was obtained. About that time, however, Jim had a little bad luck with his constituency, and they recalled him. At that time, Glenn Talbot was elected. By this time, a county shop had been built in Ravendale. Archie Hawkins of Ravendale was the road foreman. During the early and mid-1930s, while Glenn Talbot was supervisor, the county road across the Madeline Plains linking Ravendale, Termo, and Madeline was oiled for the first time. This improved travel across the plains greatly, but Glenn Talbot was instrumental in making even further improvements. The main one being in lobbying to get Highway 395 built where it is today. Once the state took control of that main road, travel conditions really improved. Well, that was the beginning of another, more modernized era. All right, next chapter titled Swain's Whiskey. Now, these were times of great difficulty. The plains were in the midst of a severe and crippling drought. There was little snow in the winter and just cold and wind. The summer seldom saw rain. The economy had gone into a slump after the war, eventually collapsing completely. For the average person on the Madeline Plains, money was a seldom seen luxury. Cattle and sheep prices plummeted to almost nothing. Employers could not pay much in the way of wages for their hired help. Room and board was often the top wage being paid, but most hired hands were happy to have it. There was at this time one money-making business, provided its operators were not visited by Uncle Sam's prohibition agents. For this was also a time of drought for those who imbibed in the alcoholic beverages. Prohibition was in full swing. But stronger than the prohibition laws was the black market in bootleg whiskey. And known all over the West was Swain's Whiskey. It is not that it was a big corporation or anything like that, but for one operation, located in one concealed and difficult-to-reach spot, the Swain boys probably pumped more lightning into the Western black market than any other single whiskey-producing outfit. Consumers came from California, Nevada, Utah, Oregon, and even Washington and Arizona to buy whiskey at the Swain's place, behind the backs of the agents, of course. The boys' mother and stepfather, Marvin and Adela Van, had left the plains by now. Abe was running the ranch at the beginning of the Prohibition. Roy was on the place, some, or working as a buckaroo for other neighbors. Fred, of course, had died in the flu epidemic, and Dugan did not come back much after the war. Abe first started running off bootleg whiskey in Elmer Kurth and Chase Spring in the back of the Swain Ranch. Theirs was a small business, putting out only enough for a small local market. It provided the refreshments for the weekends when a bunch of old local boys would get together at the Swains or Ducassi, drink whiskey, and ride broncs. The locals got used to watching out for Abe, since he liked to slip in a bottle of 180 or 190 proof once in a while as a joke. Many of it was the poor, unsuspecting fool who gagged and choked as his eyes watered and his throat burned like he had just gulped a slug of molten lead. Luckily, no one ever died, so Abe was never prosecuted for murder. Anyway, Elmer Kurth eventually went back to Susanville, and the business came to an end. But that is when the Swains gave up the kiddie games and started to get serious. There was money to be made in the moonshine business, and they were to make their share. Once it was all over, They were no richer for their efforts, however. It seemed the money went out just as fast as it came in, but everyone seemed to get a kick out of what they were doing and made a good, better living than anything else on the plains. Alan Luddy came up from Honey Lake Valley to partner with the Swains. He and his brother-in-law had been operating a still at Eagle Lake, and Luddy was an efficient whiskey maker. As the business grew, another distiller by the name of Hall Brown was brought into the operation. Originally, Abe Luddy had located a spot under Rimrock at the headwaters of Pine Creek above Horse Lake. It was easily guarded, and the only way in was on horseback. It was no small still that they poured in and installed at the site. At the still, whoever was making the lightning, Luddy or Brown, stayed right there. The huge apparatus held 350 gallons of mash, from which 30 gallons of good whiskey could be run down in a 10-hour period. After the first batch came off, a second batch would be started at 185 or 190 proof. It would be distilled until it dropped to 100 proof. Anything from 100 proof up was for the market. Whoever was operating the still would test the finished batch with a whiskey tester. Any that was above 100 proof was cut down to 100 by adding water. Brown sugar was added for coloring. Anything below 100 was dumped in with the next batch. At the Swain still, 30 gallons of whiskey was run down every day of the week. If there was 2 distillers on the scene and a double shift could work, even more was produced. Roy Swain ran the supply line. With a pack string, he hauled the grain and sugar to the still. With the same string of horses, he hauled the whiskey out in 10-gallon kegs. The Swain Ranch was the headquarters for the operation. The 10-gallon kegs were buried there to await their eventual sale and removal. The moonshine was put into gallon jugs for sale to the locals. It could be had for $10 a gallon. Any of the outsiders, or locals too for that matter, who wanted more than 10 gallons, could get it at the wholesale price of $8 a gallon. Many outsiders dealers would buy 50 to 100 gallons at a time. After all, there was a huge population out there who was willing to pay high price to have its thirst quenched. Eventually, the demand got so great that Roy's string of pack horses simply could not keep up. That is when Abe and Brown decided to build a road into the distillery, but that move was a little risky for Roy. If they were going to have a road that the agents could find and follow, he wanted out, so he quit the outfit and went back to buckarooing. In 1928, not long after the completion of the new road with Roy's warning unheeded, the feds drove right up to the still. By this time, however, there was strong opposition to prohibition on all fronts, and judges were generally handing down light sentences. Abe did not have to go to jail as many before him had. He was fined $100 and given 3 years probation. But they chopped up his still, and he went back into the moonshine business after that. It was about that same time that he sold the Swain Ranch also. Of course, prohibition was still in effect, and somebody had to supply the wants of the local people, at least. Most of the whiskey-making programs shifted to the Ravendale side of the plains at that time, although Luddy and Glenn Hooks did operate a still at Whiskey Canyon and the back of the Swain place for a while. All right, we'll stop here. Next chapter is going to be Termo to Madeline through the Depression on page 366. Have a great day.